So video camera started. So good morning everybody, welcome to week 6 of CCTA. For the last 3 weeks, as you know, you were in the capable hands of my colleague Dr. Roberts, and I'm sure he enlightened you and inspired you with all of his stuff about television and cultural studies and the public sphere and all that. So my mission today is to keep the ball moving. And we're going to talk today about this concept or this idea or this opinion or this fact, whatever it might be, that the BBC is in some way left-wing. So hopefully you've all got the PowerPoint open. Just want to do a couple of things before we start. As you know, it still seems like you've got plenty of time, but I do hope you're making progress on your assessments. So the first one, the poster, it's actually a month today. It's the 13th today, so in 4 weeks the poster presentations will happen on Zoom. And then of course the blog. I've had a few draft versions of the blog entries, and just to remind everybody else, you're more than welcome to send me one. And I'm going to emphasize the word one, because what I don't want to do is you send me one and then I put comments on it, and then you send me next version and I comment on it, and then you send me a third version. Can we just try, because you're all, I keep stressing this, you're all master's degree students, so you should be able to look at feedback and incorporate it into your work and then sort of make subsequent pieces of work better. So please don't keep coming back to me. Nobody's done it yet, but I'm just saying that just in case people think there's an unlimited number of times you can do it. So once you've received feedback, and hopefully the people who've had feedback will agree on this, it does kind of focus your vision on what needs to be done. And if you have any doubts, read the brief. Read the brief that I gave you in week 1, which is on Moodle, of course. So that's the blog, and that's a week after the poster on the 18th. And then you've got quite a long time then over Christmas, New Year, to work on the long piece of work. Can I just stress as well that if anybody wants a tutorial, then you need to ask me. I'm not going to book slots for you and say come along. Again, you're MAs, you're mature, intelligent people. So if you need a tutorial, then book some time. Come along from 12 until 1. Or if you want separate time, we can have a standalone tutorial. So hopefully you're all working hard and thinking great thoughts about your assessments. Like I said, just to emphasize, I'm assuming that you're okay unless you tell me otherwise. Next slide, number 3, a slight change of schedule, nothing to worry about. Next week it was due to be me again talking about quantitative analysis, but I've switched it, me and Chris have switched around, so you'll have Chris next week instead. So next week will be discourse and critical discourse analysis with Chris Roberts, and I'll be in week 8, which is November the 27th. I'll tell you the reason for this. It's very simple, and you sometimes hear me complain about the university, the bureaucracy. Well, sometimes I get emails that tell me you must come to this meeting, and I say, oh hang on, I'm teaching on that day, and the response is you must come to this meeting. It's ridiculous. It's a crazy world sometimes. So anyway, so I've got to go to a meeting next Friday, and it is actually, in fairness, quite important because it's the final moment to agree marks for last year's MAs. So, and that is a very, very important moment because that tells the system who graduates and what marks they get. So I've got to be there for Stand Up for MA Journalism. So no great worries, it just means that you'll see Chris next week again, and you'll see me the week after. So next slide, you may have noticed, hopefully you did, last week I sent, it was an important email actually, last week about the literature search. I hope everybody got it and I hope everybody read it. And it is desperately important because, just to stress, when you do your blog and when you do your poster and when you do assessment 3, it's really important that you include relevant references in your work. So in other words, previous academic studies that have been in the same general territory as your research. So you need to say, oh, as Simpson found in 2017, or as Hussein found in 2006. You need to reference the work to give it that academic credibility. Again, read the examples in the briefing document of how to do referencing. how to blend it into your narrative. But this email explains how you do it, and those of you who did a dissertation at undergrad, you'll know this already, so I apologise if I'm patronising you. As always, it's not my intention, it's an accident more than anything else. But if you get stuck, then ask the librarians for help. They are very, very helpful. They're helpful in real life and remotely as well. Yeah, and the key person who is the way the library works is that each department actually has its own librarian. So Stevie Russell, Stevie is a woman, by the way. I think it's short for Stephanie, Stevie. So Stevie is very helpful, and she's the librarian for the Department of Media, or the School of Arts, as it is now. So if you do get stuck about referencing, and if you can't find books and journal articles in your particular space, then ask the librarians for help. But if you follow the guidance in the email, it shows you, there's a link to a video on how to do literature searches, and so on. Okay, so any questions so far? Good. Right, let's move on. And I'll start with a cough. This week I've actually got a glass of water. I think that was the reason I was coughing last time, a dry throat. Okay, let's talk about the left-wing BBC. Now we've touched on this slightly, if you remember, in week 2, but I'm going to elaborate and discuss this in much greater depth. So let me start by throwing it back to you folks, and don't forget, if you want to make a contribution, turn your microphone on. There's nothing more amusing than seeing somebody's mouth moving and no words coming out. Well, there are things more amusing than that, but you get the idea. Okay, so next slide, number 6. What do these 26 words and phrases mean? Now, I don't want you to define all of them, but what I'd like you to do, a brave person, is to choose one, turn your microphone on, and tell us what it means. Anything you like. There's 26 to choose from. This is your opinion. Don't worry about, giving me dictionary definitions. Go on, Catherine, be brave.
Woke.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds bad. I mean, I know what it is, but don't know how to define it.
Difficult to nail down, isn't it?
Yeah.
So tell me about the context of it then, Catherine. You say you've heard of it, and it's the first word you chose. So why does it stand out for you?
I guess because it's quite relevant at the moment, with Black Lives Matter and people just being more aware of people's sort of issues in society and feeling underrepresented and I guess that's kind of why it stood out to me. I've heard it. Right, so
it's like, as you say, it's a sort of contemporary word. I was hesitant about putting that one down, and I was thinking about putting it in speech marks because it's often used in a pejorative sense, isn't it? It's often used as a criticism, as somebody who is, sort of woke. I think the origin of it is somebody who was awoken to the realities of the world. I think that's what the root of it. But you're right, Catherine. It's Black Lives Matter and sort of gender issues. And social awareness, really, isn't it? So the one above it, social justice, woke and social justice are pretty closely linked, I think. But woke, like I say, tends to be used in a sort of pejorative sense. Thank you, Catherine. Anybody else want to jump in? Or shall I pick on somebody again? Come on, we've all seen these words. Anybody?
Left, to be the left side of the political spectrum, to be considered more liberal.
Who's that, Jessie, yeah?
Yes.
Hi, Jessie. More liberal. So you think left wing and liberal, a similar sort of meaning?
Generally, the left have been more for social issues. Particularly looking at more prone to the welfare state and making sure that everyone has the basic necessities that they need generally. Right.
So you think that's in your mind that's liberal, is it, or is that left, or both? What you've just described.
Say to be liberal, you are normally on the left side of the political spectrum.
Right. Yeah. So I said right when you said left. Sorry. Correct. I agree with you. Yeah. Okay, go on, Jessie. That's good. You've kind of jumped ahead. In a few slides we're going to talk about this in more detail, but it sounds like have you studied this or have you read about it? Is it something you're familiar with?
I just hate Tories. So experience.
Okay. Well, I haven't put the word Tory on there. That's one I should have put on there. So go on, Jesse. Give me the opposite of what you've just described. Who is what is somebody's characteristics if they're not what you've just described?
So, Maggie Thatcher.
Yeah.
But basically, looking at Tories tend to put the 1% first and look after those who have higher incomes, because they aim to reduce taxes for people on higher incomes that then trickle down and affect people on lower income.
Yeah. You have studied this before, haven't you? You know quite. Did you study politics at first degree or something?
No, I did photography.
Oh right, political photography maybe. No, but you're absolutely. Can I just interrupt you? Let me just give a little recap. So you're saying the Conservatives, who are the opposite to the left wing, so the Conservatives, they're Tories, Margaret Thatcher, they're more interested in, like you say, the 1%, like the highest earners in society, the privileged few.
The example is to do with like when Margaret Thatcher was trying to revive the economy, she sold off all the council housing,
yes,
which meant that people with more money
yeah,
could then buy those houses,
yeah,
and it pushed out all of the poor people that needed to live in
yeah,
that social housing.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a key example of a difference between the Labour and Conservative government. Yeah,
very good. Okay, excellent work, Jesse. Well done. You've summed it up nicely there, and you injected a bit of your own opinion, which I like as well. So Jesse and Catherine have got the ball moving. Anybody else? Come on, Saida. You're always good for a few comments. What do you think?
Yes, hi.
Hello.
Well, he is the totalitarian regime.
Which one's this? Sorry, which one?
Authoritarian.
Authoritarian. Yes, on the right hand side, yeah. Authoritarian regime. Carry on, yeah.
So it's somebody is in charge, is like China.
Yeah.
So don't have democracy. It's somebody on the top who is ruling the country.
Yeah.
And they just give their own sort of statement, and it's more propaganda rather than the truth.
Right, so let me just recap. So authoritarian, you said like China, so it's just a few people at the top. So, and by implication, Saida, there's no elections, right?
It's no democracy.
No democracy, so what does it, when you say no democracy, what do you mean by that?
People don't choose who is in charge.
Right, so no voting.
It's like North Korea as well.
North Korea. So you're absolutely right. So authoritarian regime is somewhere that basically a one-party state. So in China, there's one political party. It's called the Chinese Communist Party.
And must have everything for people, but it doesn't work.
We'll come on to that later. So that's authoritarian. Go on, Saida. Choose another word, Saida, and tell me what you think. Fascism.
It's more like nationalism, fascism. It's just for one sort of nation and against everybody else.
Right, so give me an example of a fascist country or a fascist leadership.
Well, it used to be Nazi in Germany.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or the white supremacists in America.
Sorry, say that again.
White supremacists.
White supremacists, yeah, absolutely. So fascist. Saida gave the example of Hitler, of course, the Nazis in World War II. Another one around about the same time was Mussolini in Italy. He actually called himself a fascist. He saw it as a term of endearment almost.
Fascista.
Yes, exactly. And
anarchist is no kind of parties, I suppose, yeah?
Okay, so anarchist is basically no government. It's basically everybody doing what they want, anarchy.
Yeah.
You know, that's what anarchy means, with no state and with no legal system to really restrain us in what we do. Okay, so anybody else want to choose one of these? But thank you for all your contributions.
Yes, I've got one, sir. Here, the Conservative can be classed as a right wing, as a free market.
Yeah.
As a free market driven, and it's to do with law and order.
Conservatives, yeah.
Conservative as a free market driven and agenda of business integrity.
Right.
And favour towards stock market.
Right, yeah, absolutely. I think you've just successfully described Margaret Thatcher there. Because that's kind of what, a bit before your time maybe, Sandra, but that's essentially what she believed in, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've got the left wing can be described as a socialist agenda of a political party. And the example of that to do with the LGBT, the union and the majority as a majority group. Right.
Okay. Yeah. So that's good. So let me just interrupt. Let me just try and recap, because everybody might not be able to hear you as well as I can, Sandra. So Sandra's talking about the left and the right there, and she's differentiating between the two. So that's good. What I want to do in a minute is tie it into the American election. And one of the things that Joe Biden was accused of being was a Marxist, believe it or not. So political labels. So I think most of you, not everybody joined in, but I think pretty much everybody. There's no words on there, hopefully, that you've never heard. You know, left wing, right wing, hard left, progressive, conservative, etc. There are some of them maybe you don't hear that often. Things like reactionary. And elitist maybe, and neoliberalism is a big one, which a lot of people don't really know what it means. But the reason I'm doing this is because these are all political labels, and political labels can be extremely powerful, And not only are they just, and they're not neutral. Labels are not neutral, and this concept of labeling in media, in journalism, in research is really, really important. What label do you pin on somebody? How do you identify them? Not somebody identifying themselves necessarily, but somebody else identifying you or identifying a political position. So what I've done in the next slide, number 7, I've divided them into left and right, because they don't forget this presentation's all about the left-wing BBC. So left in red, right in blue. Now at this point I've noticed we've got 2 American students and they're not here today, but Cecily and Taylor, hopefully you will pick this up at some point. Can I just say at this point, in terms of colour, from now on in this presentation, red is connected with left and blue is connected with right. The reason I'm doing that is that's the traditional colours in Britain of left and right. In America, you may have noticed, it's the other way round. So the Republicans, the right-wing party, Donald Trump, they use red. And the Democrats, Joe Biden, they use blue. So I apologise to our American friends, but we have to, I guess we're in Britain, and you know we have to stick with the British way of doing it. So red, left, right is blue. So look at the left-wing ones. Left-wing, obviously, hard left. That kind of implies something. It's not just left-wing, it's really left-wing. Progressive is a word Americans use quite a lot to describe left-wing causes. Liberal, socialism, of course, communism, social justice and woke, as we discussed earlier. They're kind of modern interpretations. They both suggest a left-wing position. Marxist, we'll talk about Marx in a moment. Social democrat, many of the left-wing parties in Europe are called social democrat parties. Radical basically means somebody who wants a major change, a revolutionary change in the way that we do things. Identity politics, sometimes linked with woke. You know, it's all about how you identify. That's your politics, is your individual identity. And then anarchist, usually connected with the left, but it's not really, because it's neither left nor right. And then on the right, you've got right-wing, conservative. Neoliberalism is a word we use a lot in academia to describe right-wing economics. Fascist, as we discussed earlier, Hitler and Mussolini. Reactionary, Nigel Farage is the classic example of a reactionary. Somebody who really wants to turn the clock back to the 1950s, you know, when he felt safe and secure, you know, in a totally white Britain, and we still had an empire and all that sort of stuff. That's kind of a reactionary. Then you've got far right, and capitalism, of course, is an economic system that's related to the right wing. And you'll notice that some of the words, what I've done, it took me a long time to actually pick the individual letters out, but populist, libertarian, nationalist and elitist, they are words which can be applied to both left and right. So a libertarian, you can have a libertarian on the left, and you can have a libertarian on the right. You can have a populist, a left-wing populist, and a right-wing populist, and so on. But the key point here, folks, is that this whole idea of left-right is not as simple as it looks. It's not as simple as it looks. So whenever somebody says to you the BBC is left-wing, just be very, very careful about what they actually mean. because it might be any of those words in red, or maybe some that I haven't even listed. Next slide. And the thing about labels is they are very powerful. They are extremely powerful. And as you know, last week we had this election in the States, which is still to be resolved, although I think most sane people will agree that Biden did actually win it. But there are still debates going on. And I was listening to the radio. I've listened to the radio a lot over the last week, and CNN. I've been glued to CNN. It's become my new favourite TV show. I didn't think it's possible to watch one news programme for 9 hours, but I managed it several times actually. And as you probably know, Florida, which was seen as being a swing state, it actually went Republican by quite a large margin. And there was a woman being interviewed on the radio. She was an official of the Democratic Party. And she said that the Republicans, so Trump's party, in Florida repeatedly labelled the Democrats as socialists. So they said Joe Biden was a socialist. And sometimes even communists as well. And clearly this had a negative impact, she said, on the high proportion of voters in the state with Cuban roots. And if you know the history of North America, the Caribbean, there was a revolution in Cuba in the 1950s, and there was a guy who died relatively recently called Fidel Castro, who was the leader of the revolution, and he was in power for many years in Florida. And many Cubans in the 50s, they actually left Cuba because they were scared of what Castro and communism would bring to the island. And many of them settled in Florida, and now their children and their children's children, they still have this collective memory of the bad days of Castro and the revolution. So if you want to get those people on your side, you just call the opposition socialists, and they automatically think, shit, pardon my language, they automatically think Castro, they automatically think communism, they automatically think bad things. And as I said at the bottom there, the Democrat Party official said, and I'm paraphrasing here, so I haven't got it quite right, she said it's a powerful one-word accusation that takes a lot of time and effort to disprove. So if you label somebody as a socialist or a fascist or a communist or whatever, it tends to stick, like we say, the mud tends to stick, and it's very, very difficult to throw it off. So labels here, really, really important. And this is maybe an idea for some of your research, how labels are used in news reports, how they are used to categorise somebody, and how they are used in many ways to bring somebody down. And I put at the bottom another example, Jeremy Corbyn. And as you know, he was Labour leader for what, 4 years, 5 years, and throughout that period, and there's some research at the end I'll point you in the direction of, throughout that period he was consistently given certain labels by the media, not just the right-wing media, but also by the organisations like The Guardian, which you think is left-wing, but it's not necessarily, and the BBC. So Corbyn was called Marxist, he was called far-left, he was called anti-Semitic, of course, he was called racist, he was called a terrorist sympathiser. And so Corbyn, for much of his time in office or in that position, his role was first of all to try and convince people that he's none of those things, you know. And as we know, he lasted about 4 or 5 years. But it must have been a terrible thing every day to have to explain why you're not racist. And if you look at that guy's history, he's devoted virtually all of his life to anti-racism. It's Corbyn racist was the largest stretch of imagination possible. Anyway, but the key point here is that labels, pejorative labels, can be extremely powerful, and they can be used in political contests. So let's go back to the BBC, slide number 9. So as we know, I mentioned this in week 2, so this is a common opinion that the BBC somehow is over there on the left side of the spectrum. And why is this important? It's important, just to reiterate, because we have a normative expectation about the BBC. We expect it to be politically neutral. That's what the Charter says. So there is a Bill of Parliament, an Act of Parliament that says the BBC must be impartial in its reporting. And what that means at the bottom from editorial guidelines, impartiality requires us to be fair and open-minded when examining the evidence and weighing all the material facts, as well as being objective and even-handed in our approach to a subject. So I said the classic example, Question Time, the TV programme. On the panel, they will have the chair, I think it's Fiona Bruce these days, you'll have a Labour Party representative, a Conservative Party representative, and a couple of other people, and the idea is that those views are balanced out. Now clearly you can't do that on every single TV programme or every news report, but over a period of time the BBC should give impartial reporting to its viewers and to its listeners. So that's what we expect, that's why it's important. So the BBC we would expect to be there. We'd expect the BBC to be in the middle, to not favour the left and to not favour the right. But like I said, don't just look at one article and say, oh, it was left-wing in this article, or it was right-wing in that article. You need to look at numerous articles over a period of time to really assess whether the BBC is one way or the other, or straight down the middle. So that's what we expect. That's the statutory commitment. That's what the BBC is tasked with doing. That's its role in life when it comes to journalism, is to tell us about the world in impartial, unbiased ways. And as we know, it's a common opinion. I gave this example in week 2. Nigel Farage, 2015, and Janet Daly in the Daily Telegraph. And there was a couple of other examples, if you remember. But this opinion has been floating around for a long, long time. And in recent years it's become even more pronounced. And now, of course, the debate, I'll put it in speech marks because it's not really a debate. A debate is when two sides actually listen to each other. And I don't see much evidence of this with those who accuse the BBC of being left-wing. But look at the language. I mentioned this 2 weeks ago. I've highlighted some of the phrases. This is online on Facebook. BBC is well known for its bias. It's a extreme far-left Marxist organisation. Notice when these people are using these labels, they don't explain it. They don't explain it. They just pin the label on. They say, right, you're Marxist, you're far-left. Leftist agenda in the middle. And on the right hand side, the one at the bottom is probably the most verbose. BBC equals biased broadcasting channel, pro-Muslim left-wing socialist channel. So you've got 3 or 4 pejorative phrases in there, and when they say pro-Muslim, they're implying that it's a negative thing, of course. And likewise left-wing and socialists and so on. So this is where we're at the moment with, and I'll put it in speech marks again, the debate about the left-wing BBC. There's a bunch of people, quite a large bunch of people out there who believe that the BBC is Marxist, left-wing, communist, whatever you want to call it. So that is essentially what the second part of this class today is going to look at. So what we'll do in the second half is we'll test the hypothesis. So the hypothesis, if you remember, is a theory, a suspicion, something which you believe to be true. So let's just say that the BBC is left-wing. How would we actually find out whether it is left-wing or not? But the first step here, which is what I'm going to do for the first half of the class today, and this is going to take some time, but it's desperately, desperately important. First of all, we need to define what is meant by left-wing. But let me give you, slide number 16, let me give you a sort of idea about the origins of left-wing and what left-wing actually means and what it covers, because it has actually changed over time. So slide 16, we're going to go back into history for a moment because it's important to see politics in a historical context. So what I've done on slide 16 is I've got 2 bars there. Each cell represents 100 years. So the top line 0, 100, 200, that's 100 AD, 200 AD, 300 AD, 400 AD, etc. The second bar is 1000 AD, so 1200, 1300, all the way to the 1900s. And bottom line, there we are, about a fifth of the way through the cell that says 2000. So there we are in 2020. So I think this is important because when you visualize time, you realize in some ways we've come a long way, but in other ways we haven't. So since Jesus Christ was born in the year 0, that's where we start counting from, right? AD, Anno Domini. So since Jesus' time in year 0, that's 2020 years, which seems like a long time because we all live for about 70, 80 years, or maybe a bit longer if we're lucky. So 2020 years sounds like a long time, but it's not really when you consider how long we've had human beings on the planet, or how long the planet existed. And basically for most of that period that you see in front of you, there was very, very little change. So somebody born in, say, the year 800 AD, if that person was then transported 500 years into the future, into 1300 AD, he or she wouldn't actually notice that much difference, because not really that much had changed, both in terms of technology and how people worked and earned their money, but also in terms of politics. So next slide, slide number 17. And this is where it really starts coming home how far we've moved in recent years. So think about it, from the time of Jesus, right, so year zero, until the 1600s, political power in the UK was in basically two places. It was in the hands of the monarch, typically the king, sometimes the queen, and also the church. So in terms of our sort of moral guidance and what was right and what was wrong and how things work, typically that came from the church. And it also came from the monarch as well. So the monarch, typically he had ultimate power all the way through until the 1600s. So that's virtually all the way through the second line on that chart. Parliament existed in the UK, but it took its orders from the king or the queen. So the monarch was in charge. The vast majority of people, so your and my ancestors, all those years ago, folks, unless you're lords and ladies, I don't think you are, the vast majority of people, our ancestors, had no voice and no power at all, or very, very, very little. So there's no MPs that we could vote for. And that form of government has got a name, and it's called autocracy. Autocracy. So you may have heard that. So an autocrat is a leader. So somebody like the guy in Korea, Kim Jong-un, is that his name? And also the Chinese Communist Party. So that they have there's the premier Xi Jinping, is that right? And the Communist Party. So that's an autocracy as well. So autocracies still exist in the world. Not so many, some in the Middle East as well, people like Assad in Syria. You know, he is the boss, he is effectively the monarch of that country and various other countries as well. So in Western countries and North America, we've kind of moved away from that. And it really started to happen, slide number 18, it really started to happen in the UK in the 1600s. So we had this thing called the English Civil War, which hopefully you've all heard about because it was a pivotal moment in British history. So what the English Civil War did with Oliver Cromwell, as you remember, one of the main characters in that episode, and the English Civil War deposed the monarch, Charles I, and established Parliament as the centre of political power. That was truly revolutionary. So before that, the king was in charge. After that time, it was Parliament that was in charge. Okay, really, really important. And so hence power started to be shared. Excuse me. Even so, this is an important point to make, even so common people, so my ancestors and probably your ancestors, did not have a vote. We had no say in who was in Parliament. And the UK was controlled by wealthy landowners. Oliver Cromwell was a wealthy landowner, as was many of his colleagues in Parliament. And the church was still very influential as well. So by 1600, 1650, we had a little bit of a change. We started to become a bit more democratic, but the name given to that type of government is still not democracy. That's what you call plutocracy. Plutocracy, which means rule by the wealthy. And again, there are arguably some countries in the world that are plutocracies. And some people I've even heard say that America is a plutocracy. And that the UK is a plutocracy. I'm not sure about that, but I can see what they mean, because our representatives do tend to be quite wealthy. So it's the wealthy ruling the not so wealthy, perhaps. Fast forward again, let's move into the next century. So the 1700s on slide 19. This is when things really start to change. The 1700s and the 1800s. I mentioned this in week 2. There was this period called the Enlightenment, when philosophers, famous philosophers, started to question and think about some of the attitudes and the beliefs that we had. So things like freedom, liberty, morality, they started to be challenged. Previously, we were guided there by the Bible and by the church, but these philosophers started to question that using logic and theories and so on. And the other thing that happened, which is a spin-off of all that vibrant thinking, was the Industrial Revolution. So steam power, iron and steel, canals, railways, factories and all that sort of stuff. They prompted enormous changes in people's lives in many different ways. So you've got those two revolutions going on, an intellectual revolution connected with an industrial revolution. And as a consequence of that thinking and the questioning, some I would say some positive things started to happen. Key legislation, the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 in the UK. I'm not talking about America, that came later, 1865. But the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, that was a result of these philosophers questioning what freedom and liberty and morality actually meant. That was the first time really that people had done that and started to think about other people's lives. The Factory Act in the same year, 1833. Believe it or not, until 1833, it was legal for 9-year-old children to work in coal mines. And if you look at some, there were no photographs back then, but there are paintings and pictures of poor little kids of 8, 9 years old working in factories in terrible conditions. No schooling, no schooling, terrible conditions, working in coal mines for 10, 12 hours a day. And we look back on that period now and we think it's barbaric, but there was a time before 1833 that it was perfectly acceptable. So you could say that we started to make progress as humanity in the middle of the 19th century. The Slavery Abolition Act, obviously that's a huge step forward, the Factory Act, and then the Reform Acts. And the word is a little bit deceptive. What it actually means is voting reform. Prior to 1832, hardly anybody voted. But from 1832 and then in 1867 and then again in 1885, the franchise, as it's known, the number of people allowed to vote was expanded and expanded. So by 1885, most men could vote. By 1885, I'll come on to women in one moment, but in 1885 most men actually had the vote. So instead of having, go back a couple of hundred years, a king who tells us what to do, we now have a parliament, but not only a parliament, we have a representative parliament where normal people start to have a say in what their world and what their lives will be. Let me just stop for a moment. Oh, let me just go back. So we do have, I put at the bottom, democracy question mark. So we've got a form of democracy. By the mid 1800s, we have a form of democracy, which, as you will see in a moment, is expanded even more. Let me just talk here and just stop for a moment and talk about the advent, the arrival of left-wing politics. So somebody mentioned Karl Marx earlier. So here he is in the middle, an early photograph of the man with his fantastic beard and his serious pose. So Marx, even if you don't agree with Marx, I don't think anybody would deny that he was a major intellectual force, and in many ways he determined the future of the world for the next, this isn't an overstatement really, the next 150 years. And you look back on the Cold War during my youth, so Russia and nuclear weapons and China and America and all that sort of stuff. That wouldn't have really happened without the thinking of Karl Marx, because the communists in Russia and China, they kind of interpreted his works in a certain way. I think he would have been horrified if he'd known how his work was interpreted by those regimes. But basically Karl Marx is the grandfather of left-wing politics, essentially. I don't think that's any exaggeration to say that. And his grand idea, and it's important to stress here that it was a utopian vision. In other words, a fantasy. His fantasy, which he thought would one day be attainable, but certainly not in his life, was this idea of communism. And he pitched communism against capitalism on the right there. So the right-wing politics was all about capitalism. Capitalism is what created the factories, which is what is driven by profit. So you had industrialists who were basically exploiting workers, exploiting the environment in Marx's mind, to create profits for themselves. And Marx studied that world, 1850-ish. He studied that world and looked at the factories and looked at how wealth was created and how it was distributed. So he analysed the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and he argued that the working class, in other words, the vast majority of the population of the UK, were oppressed. They were being exploited. They suffered unnecessarily from poor working conditions and terrible living conditions and unsanitary conditions and awful wages. And they gained little from the profit-making process. So he was the first person really to criticise capitalism, to criticise right-wing economics. The ultimate solution, said Marx, was for the people to join together, to create a more just and equitable world. So he came up with this idea of this utopian society. Communism in its pure form means no government, it means no money, it means everybody. It's like that John Lennon song, isn't it? Imagine. Just everybody living in perfect harmony and peace. And sharing everything, you know. So that was his utopian vision. And the two key words at the bottom, Marx was all about the collective, people working together, looking after each other. And that's really what Marx was all about. And on the right hand side, as I said, his work was really a reaction against capitalism. So during Marx's time, economic and political power remained in the hands of the rich and privileged, even though after those acts of parliament like the Reform Acts and so on, capitalism was seen by these people as being the natural order of things, and that capitalists resisted government legislation to put limits on their profit-making activities. So when the law was passed that said you can't have kids working in factories, capitalists objected to it. And the same when the slavery was abolished, capitalists objected to it, because it interfered with their profit-making process. So there's a big moral element to Marxism as well. It's all about standing up for people and people getting together and to basically, as he said, to throw off the chains of oppression. That's what Marx is all about. So truly revolutionary thinking. Nobody had really come up with any of these ideas before Karl Marx. So Marx was a revolutionary in the truest intellectual sense of the word. Let's move forward a little bit into the 20th century. In the late 1800s, many people were inspired by Marx and other thinkers at the time. There were various others, Ruskin and Russell and people like that. And this period saw the growth of trade unions. That's when trade unions were basically invented. That's the idea of working people campaigning for better paying conditions, getting together as a group in a factory, and if the paying conditions are really bad and the managers won't negotiate, the only weapon the workers have is to withdraw their labour. That's the only power they have. That's what strikes were all about, and still are to a large extent. Round about the same time, intellectuals and also Christian socialists. There was a big bunch of Christians who read the Bible in a slightly different way, and they saw the morality of it, and they also looked very closely at the teachings of Jesus. And if you just isolate Jesus' comments from the Bible, take everything else out and just focus on Jesus, some people say that Jesus is a socialist. And you think about how Jesus stood up for the downtrodden, for the oppressed, to the people on the fringes of society, and you can see why people say that. You know, throwing the moneylenders out of the temple. You know, you could say the moneylenders were essentially the capitalists, you know. But so there's that idea that if you interpret the Bible in that way, because there's lots of different ways of interpreting the Bible. Every branch of Christianity has its own slight variation. But if you look at the work of Jesus by himself, some people would say that Jesus was a socialist. I don't know whether that's true. That's a case for debate. But I can see what they mean. So there was a bunch of Christians who joined together with the trade unionists and various intellectuals, and they created the Labour Party in 1900. A great year to start a new party, start of a century, 1900. The Labour Party came into existence. And for the first time, a big moment, the working class people had a political party to represent their interests, and some of the early MPs were factory workers and farm workers and humble people from humble backgrounds. Again, it's the first time it had ever happened. It had taken so long though, folks. Think about it. That's 1900 years since Jesus was born. We finally got to the point where working people have representation in Parliament. Let's move on, because of course democracy wasn't perfect, because half the population didn't have the vote. So 100 years ago, and I'm sure all the women in the class are fully aware of this, 100 years ago, folks, your lives would have been completely different. And it's only 100 years. So 100 years ago, you didn't have a vote. You were not allowed to become MPs. It was pretty much unheard of for women to work in what's called professional jobs, lawyers, doctors, teachers. And there was something I read last night, actually. Apparently, if you were a teacher, female teacher, or a nurse in 1920, if you got married, you had to quit your job. That was a new one on me. But the idea was that women's role in those days is in the home, looking after the kids. So even if you had a job, a nurse or a teacher, and then you got married, you basically had to leave your job. I didn't know that until last night. I find that amazing. So anyway, a big moment, 1918. So I put there some women were permitted to vote. All women didn't get the vote until 1928. in 1918 you had to be basically a middle class woman. Working class women didn't get the vote until 1928. Even so, it was a big moment when half the population was suddenly, well, not suddenly, it was a long fight, but they eventually got involved. The next big step in the 20th century, there are lots of big steps, but I've just chosen 3 here. In the late 1940s, of course, after World War II, the Labour government introduced what we now call the welfare state. So this included the National Health Service, which is one of the most popular institutions in the whole UK. It's incredibly popular, and it's and most people have only got positive things to say about it. This includes National Health Service and also improved pension and welfare benefits. So the idea here, the socialism here from the Labour Party, it was unashamedly socialist. The Labour Party came up with this phrase, from the cradle to the grave. So the state looks after everybody from the cradle to the grave. But it's not just the state, because the state is us. It's a representative democracy. So it's this idea that we're all looking after each other. And that's quite a powerful concept. But again, think about it. It took all that time to get to this point. The welfare state didn't come about until the late 1940s. To put it into perspective, that's within my mum's generation. My mum remembers life before the welfare state. You know, so maybe some of your grandparents will also remember it as well. So it's not that long ago. The next crucial period, in my mind, a lot of this is opinion. I've been very selective here. I've just chosen 3 things. The next really big change in politics and representation came in the 1960s. And this is often called, the 60s and 70s is often called a social revolution. So during that decade, from about 1960 to about 1970, there were enormous changes. And a lot of it was a result of campaigning and protest and debate and argument and so on. But in the UK and other European countries and in North America, there were lots of changes that affected people's lives. Not just economic, this is more on the social side. For example, Obscene Publications Act 1959. Prior to that, you could actually go to jail if you wrote a book or made a record or made a film that was what people called obscene. And obscene was it's not what we call obscene now. Obscene back then in the 50s and the 60s was actually something that we think is quite tame these days. So that was, the Obscene Publications Act redefined what obscene was, and over the next 20 years that was reduced and reduced and reduced. The idea here, folks, is that we as human beings should be able to decide what we read and see and watch. We don't need the government to tell us what's right and what's wrong. So that was the reason that the Obscene Publications Act was amended and changed. 1965, up until that point, Britain, like every other country in the world, pretty much had the death penalty for murder. But it was debated in Parliament, and there were some high-profile cases of people who had the death penalty and then they were then proven to be innocent. That's pretty shocking, isn't it, to kill an innocent person charged with murder? So as a consequence of that, the life sentence replaced murder as the penalty I'll say that again. Life sentence replaced the death penalty as a sentence for murder. Women's rights made huge advances in the 1960s. Something which isn't on here, because it wasn't an Act of Parliament, was the advent of the birth control pill in the early 1960s. So that was very liberating for women, because it meant that women could regulate their own fertility. The divorce laws were changed in 1969. Prior to that, it was very, very difficult for a woman who's in an abusive relationship or a relationship which isn't working to actually get out, quite often because she was financially dependent on the man. So many women were actually trapped in marriages. So the divorce law changed that. The divorce law gave this idea that if a couple separate and one is the breadwinner and the other one isn't, then the one who is a breadwinner supports the person who left the marriage. That was, again, a revolutionary idea in the 60s, but now most people accept that it's appropriate. The abortion was legalised under certain strict conditions in 1967. Again, that was a reaction to the realities at the time when abortion was illegal. There was something called backstreet abortions, which were basically women who have an unwanted pregnancy going to somebody who is not a trained doctor and doing the abortion for them, and it was very, very dangerous. and also very illegal as well. So the abortion laws were changed. And another one, a big one, believe it or not, up until 1970, it was perfectly legal for an employer to advertise a job and say men get £10 an hour, women get £6 an hour. That was perfectly legal until 1970, when the Equal Pay Act came in and said that men and women doing the same job should get the same pay. So women's rights took huge advances in the 1960s and 70s. The same as well in terms of ethnic minorities. There was 3 Race Relations Acts, so-called, 1965, 68 and 76. Each one of those increased the amount of protection, if you like, given to ethnic minorities. So, like with women, in the 60s, it was acceptable to put an advert, for a job that specified white people only. That was acceptable in my lifetime. That was, and it's absolutely frightening when you think about that now, that you could specify somebody's skin colour or ethnicity in a job advert. You can't do that anymore. The Race Relations Act sorted that one out. Likewise with pay, likewise with various other things. Also, just finishing off here, LGBTQ, Sexual Offences Act 1967. Until that point, it was illegal to basically be gay before 90, which I find absolutely remarkable. How you can incriminate somebody for basically following their heart and being the person that they are. So before that, it was illegal, and you could actually go to jail. A famous person who went to jail, of course, was Oscar Wilde back in the 19th century. But from that moment on, then it was okay to have a loving relationship with another man. So that was a big moment as well for gay rights, as it was called in those days. So in the 1960s, the revolution, I've highlighted it in red because it is a left-wing thing, really. This is called social liberalism. Social liberalism. And in many ways, the 60s define the modern world. They certainly define my generation. I was born in the 60s. Compare my beliefs to my parents' beliefs, they are quite different, and it's all because of the 60s. And your generation, of course, which is the next generation on, typically, I wouldn't say everybody, but typically, dare I say that you take a lot of these things for granted. But they were long, drawn-out, hard-fought political battles, believe it or not. And you might not obviously agree with them all, but we'll come on to that in a moment. So let's talk about left and right-wing politics now. So the reason that these social changes happened, the social revolution, is that many people, young people, rediscovered Marx. And they began to identify other groups of oppressed people. So oppression, these people argued, was not just an economic issue. So Marx was mostly about economics. He spoke about the working class and working conditions and pay and so on. But in the 60s and 70s, people start to realise that it was a social issue as well. It's a social issue. So the oppressed groups are not just the working class. Women are oppressed. Ethnic minorities are oppressed. LGBTQ people are oppressed. Disabled people are oppressed. So they used essentially Marxist arguments to try and get a better world for these different groups of people. And in modern times, sort of in the recent 10 years or so, there has been a resurgence of interest in other oppressed groups. So you've got Black Lives Matter, you've got Me Too, you've got women's pay at the BBC, it's a big issue, it's on the news this week. Focusing on one of these groups is sometimes known as identity politics. So even though you might not know it, if you are campaigning for Black Lives Matter, in some ways your actions, your cause is inspired by Karl Marx, because it's all about standing up for oppressed groups, people that are perceived to be oppressed groups. So Marx is still relevant today. And one of the negative labels that the woke or social justice warriors are given is Marxist. And in some ways it's correct, but it's done in a pejorative way rather than a simple descriptive way. So number 26. Number 26. And this is, I say this about most slides, but this one really is important. So politics these days, what we're trying to do here is define left wing. Let's go back to what we're doing. We're trying to define left wing. But the key point is that politics these days, and in fact all days, can be more accurately measured on two scales. So there's an economic scale and there's a social scale. An economic scale and a social scale. So really, when people say the BBC is left wing, my question back to them would be, on the right hand side there, do you mean that the BBC's left wings in terms of its economic reporting or in terms of its social reporting? Because they're related, but they're actually two different things. And let me explain what I mean by that. In fact, let's have a bit of an early break, folks, just so I can go and get a cup of tea.